We know Mass Effect 4 is taking place in 100 years or so in the future, and we've seen enough to know certain races will make an appearance in this game. Races such as the Asari, Salarians, and Quarians and Turians. But these teases and silhouettes aren't really enough to actually tell you the current status of each group post-Reaper War. So the question you're asking now is, what's happened to the Quarians of 2186? Have they birthed their first and second children of Rannoch? Or did life for their race as we know it end over here? And where is Rannoch, one of the oldest races in the cycle? Did they prevail like all insectoids generally do when presented with extinction-like events? Or are they simply gone? And how about the machines? Was there a happy ending for Legion, ED, and every other synthetic life to be? And if not, does a genocidal war rage on between our species? Or is it a cold one presented as an uneasy peace? And how about the Krogans, the most resilient species of them all? Are they still present, living their best life? Or does the genophage still haunt them, putting them further and further into the realm of extinction? And let's not forget about the Salarians, Turians, Yarg, Vulture, Asari, the Council, the Riders, Geth, the Andromeda Initiative. Let's not forget about you, Commander Shepard. Did you choose to destroy, control, or did you usher in a new type of species to replace everything that was? But more importantly, will you grace us with your presence one last time? Do you want to talk about it? Let's go.
Quarians and the Destruction Timeline.
The Quarians' position in the galaxy is probably the most interesting one to analyze, because they're actually one of the only two races in Mass Effect that could have been wiped out if the cards fell correctly. And by cards falling correctly, I mean there are multiple different scenarios in which they live and don't. And the first multiverse-like scenario in this timeline which leads to this is the Battle of Rannoch, when you fail to convince them to stand down. Meaning, no Quarians in Mass Effect 4, 5, and any other subsequent sequels.
Destruction Timeline.
But if you really think about it, nothing is actually explicitly confirmed with this ending, and the implication of the Quarians' destruction as a race is inferred at best or comes solely from your imagination. And I'm not trying to say you overreached in thoughts. The storytelling and the gravity of the situation would indicate a complete wipeout. I'm trying to say, do we have confirmation that every Quarian was on that ship? You don't. But you don't even have to think too much about it because you're a Mass Effect fan. And because you're a Mass Effect fan, you're already aware 4,000 Quarians made their way to Andromeda in 2185 on the ship known as Kila Sia, just before the Battle of Rannoch. Now, you could say that vessel is Andromeda bound, so it doesn't count. And that would be a good argument to make, as this game is likely a direct sequel to Mass Effect 3. Meaning, the Milky Way is your playground, and every event that happened in this rich galaxy is your pretext or backdrop. But you also have to consider the partial confirmation that some of the Andromeda races will make an appearance in this game. And if that's the case, then it's easy to theorize how the Andromeda Quarians could repopulate or replace that void left by their Milky Way cousins. And we could just leave it there and call it a day. The Quarians are present in the Milky Way galaxy and by extension Mass Effect 4. But let's ignore that for a second and pretend the Andromeda cousins perished on their way there or refused to come back for whatever reason. There's still a viable way to make things work with the destruction ending. And I'm saying that because I don't think we need to go that far to get an Andromeda fix for this timeline. And my reasoning for that is, not all Quarians were present in the Andromeda Initiative or in the battle for Rannoch. And it's easy to come to that conclusion because we know Quarians embark on pilgrims, a cultural event where young members separate from their flotilla to explore the galaxy by themselves for a duration of time, which in return should provide the young Quarian with new skills and experience that benefits the fleet upon their return. So if we go on the assumption that the Quarians lost the Battle of Rannoch, the question is, how many pilgrims were away during this encounter? And is that number viable for the continued existence of their race? And to do that calculation, we'll take the number of Quarians present before the battle, which rounds up to around 17 million. So if 5 to 8% were away on their pilgrimage, that would leave roughly 850,000 Quarians in the wild. However, it was also pointed out that a recall by their governments was enacted just before the battle with the Geth. So let's consider that point and be more conservative. I'm going to put the number of Quarians and defectors outside the Battle of Rannoch at 2%. That will put the number of Quarians in the Milky Way at around 340,000. But maybe I'm too pessimistic with those numbers. The Quarians are known to be somewhat family orientated, so it would make sense a larger portion of them would go to support their friends, family, and loved ones. And if not for them, then for the survival of their race. So let's put the number at 0.5%. That's still 85,000 in the wild that survived extinction. Now, if you say that's a small number for any level of viability in this game, the first question I would put to you is, what number of Quarians must be present to make them as a group viable going forward? The next question I would ask you is, how many Quarians did you actually meet during your Mass Effect playthrough? How many did you talk to, fight, flirt, or interact with? Did you manage to count all 17 million on the Migrant fleet and its surrounding ships? You more than likely only came across 100 or so against a backdrop of around a couple of thousands to make story points like the Migrant fleet believable. And to do that, you didn't need 17 million Quarians. To clarify, my point here is, there's a lot of leeway and flexibility in playing with these in-game numbers. Bioware could have easily said 1 million Quarians or even half that are present in the game and you wouldn't know any better. In fact, you would have deemed that as viable and called it lore. But that's the game. Let's talk realism. Around 900,000 years ago on planet Earth, there are around 1,280 human beings left, meaning a drop of 95 to 98% occurred in the global human population. This was likely due to some climate or other catastrophic event, but the point here isn't really the cause. The point is, the number was deemed viable enough for our species to survive, and the proof is me, you, and everyone else watching this video. If 1,280 human beings can make it pre-technology, then so can 85,000 Quarians. So, now that that's cleared up, where are the Quarians post-Reaper War? Where are the Quarians in Mass Effect 4? First up, synthesis. But if we go with synthesis, the Quarian story is looking pretty good. Out of all the races, they're the ones to benefit the most from all the body composition changes. I don't know what else to call the fusion of organic and synthetics, but Quarians now have the ability to inhabit various different habitats, ones that were deemed unviable due to their weak immune system. This in theory would also give the Quarians the ability to actually expand outwards and start establishing colonies, which I think they will, because not every expansion is based on conquering for the sake of it. The vast majority of time it's about resources, which the Quarians will need given the expanding population isn't bottlenecked by the amount of ships they have. Now in terms of what happens to the Flotilla, it's still there, just not as populated as it once was. And my prediction here is its main use will now be converted to transportation and military. I say this because while the Quarians as a group might not be a force to reckon with, their flotilla is. Its multi-use purpose should aid them in a universe where ships are the most important currency, especially when it comes to the repopulation of the galaxy. While this analogy might not map on one-to-one, Think about how the British Empire became the British Empire.
Ships. It was ships that allowed the British Empire to do what they did.
This is not to say the Quarians will be the main player in the next Mass Effect game, but their status has certainly increased. Which brings us to the next point. Politics. On a political front, whatever negative stereotype plagued the Quarians has largely been forgotten due to their support in the Reaper War. This means if a new council was being formed, the Quarians would be in good graces and would likely get a seat. But it is also possible with the other council members in a weakened position, lawlessness would have plagued the galaxy, and with no central power able to control the situation, the Quarians could theoretically rise to play more of a prominent role with or without the council. I don't think this is necessarily likely, as the Quarians don't strike me as that kind of guy, but the council did ostracize them for many years. The council did take a kuna from them, so it's possible they may go renegade and chart their own path. Now, in a situation where the Quarians lose to the Geth on Rannoch, the synthesis timeline is still somewhat beneficial to their race, at least more on an individual level due to their biological benefits I mentioned earlier. As a group, however, they're not as relevant in the affairs or the day-to-day happenings of the Milky Way, which was already limited pre-Reaper invasion. I'm not trying to boil this down to a numbers game, but losing your ships and probably the vast majority of your population would cause significant harm to any race going forward. So as a result, the Quarians' role in this timeline is more akin to the Drells. Now, how they make a comeback as a group will be totally reliant on their Andromeda counterparts linking up with them, or new firm leadership that's able to galvanize them into a specific goal. But the key takeaway here is, unlike the other endings, synthesis provides the Quarians with a biological foundation to build from, and how far they can take that doesn't ultimately depend if they have Rannoch or not. It does depend, however, on labor and resources that they are severely lacking if they lost the Battle of Rannoch. Speaking of losing labor and resources, let's talk about Destroy. The Destroy option poses the biggest threats to the Quarian race out of all three endings, and that's regardless if they won the Battle of Rannoch or not. I say that because the Destroy ending acts as a sort of EMP blast, wiping out all synthetics and severely damaging technology. As the Quarians are primarily based on their ships, which you could also call their homes, any direct hit would pretty much wipe them out, and even minor damages could lead to dire consequences. But let's start by focusing on the aftermath of the Quarians destroying the Geth and reclaiming Rannoch. Like everyone else, they showed up for the Battle of Earth and bailed once the relay started charging and expanding. In a scenario where their flotilla stays intact and doesn't fall apart mid-flight, there's a possibility of a crash landing. This very scenario occurred in Mass Effect 3 when the Normandy was trying to escape from the exact same blast. Now, the main difference between both landings is the Quarians are not really well equipped to last on a non-functioning ship, especially on one that doesn't cater to their needs. However, they are accustomed to surviving on limited resources due to their current situation, so truth be told, I don't foresee any issues here, as long as they have a relatively good solid foundation of equipment to pull from, which they should, as their flotilla is brimming with parts to use. Now, throw in the Quarians' tech-savvy skills, and you could make a good argument they are the most well-equipped race in the crash landing scenario, just after the Krogans. And to be clear, when I say crash landing, I'm talking about being stranded on a planet. Another point to bring up is the Destroy's ending's effect on the Quarians' enviro suits. Now, we've seen it pass through other races with little to no effect, which makes sense. It primarily targets anything of a synthetic nature, which in theory could mean a total shutdown for the Quarians, leaving them exposed to the elements and microbes, which will lead to additional fatalities. However, I don't believe their suits are heavily reliant on synthetics, and the parts that do likely don't play a major role in any core functions. And I'm talking breathing, cleaning, and protection. It's also not a reach to think their suits have backups separate from the main frame to combat this specific scenario. Essentially what I'm saying is, Hacking a Quarian suit or being hit by an EMP blast shouldn't spell the end of the Quarian. That would be incompetence and negligence at the highest order. To clarify, I don't have any evidence to back this claim up, and I saw nothing that would indicate this, but common sense would suggest this train of thinking is accurate. So again, the Quarians as a race in Mass Effect 4 are doing rather well. This comes primarily from them having a planet to build from and general acceptance by the members of the galaxy, making them into somewhat of a major player again. But if the Geth won the Battle of Rannoch, the Quarians by default are more or less done as a force and population. The remaining survivors don't reap the political benefits they would have received if they participated in this war, so their social status as a group further diminishes. What could happen here is the returning Quarians from Andromeda would link up with their Milky Way counterparts, and it's possible some sort of resentment might build up as they realize their race was wiped out for the second time by the Geth. This in itself could be an interesting story where you have a Cerberus-like movement building up among the Quarian masses. But this resentment and desire for justice might take a back seat because even though they lost the Battle of Rannoch, even though their population has been decimated again, in the red ending, all synthetics have been destroyed. The Quarians lost the Battle of Rannoch along with everything, but by default, they won the war. They have their home back, and that in itself is another jumping off point for their race. Now, don't expect them to play a major role in the galaxy. They're severely lacking in resources and labor, but it's easy to imagine them being somewhat successful as their population recovers. Whether that's with the Andromeda Quarians or not will be dependent on the story being told. Which brings us to the last ending. Control. There's nothing really new that happens with this ending, to be honest. All points in Destroy can be applied here, except the Quarians don't get their home back if they lose the Battle of Rannoch. So you could argue this is the worst case scenario, and it probably is. The synthetics are still around, and the remaining Quarians have witnessed their people's destruction again, with the added insult of nothing to show for it. No benefits from synthesis. No regaining control of Rannoch from Destroy, just resentment across the board. You could make an argument that Reaper Shepherd would take the right steps in providing the Quarians with a new home. After all, she has a galaxy map spanning billions of years, and if not that, at least force the Elcor to share the planet of Akuna with them. While it might sound a bit far-fetched, I think there's enough evidence to support this approach. To round up, in the timelines where the Quarians defeat the Geth and control Rannoch, whether that be Destroy, Control, or Synthesis, they're in a pretty good position, especially with Synthesis, which has given them the ability to reach out and expand without biological limitations. The Destroy and Control ending comes down to subjectivity. If you choose red, they lose lives but gain all the political benefits. If you choose blue, they don't lose as much, but they do lose autonomy to Reaper Shepherd. Now, if the Quarians lose Rannoch, they're still present in all endings, and their numbers will likely increase when their Andromeda counterparts show up. However, they're not as relevant in the galaxy's affairs and day-to-day operations, at least until somebody from their end wants revenge. And the best outcome to manifest or squash this revenge is the Destroy ending, where the Geth have been wiped out, giving the Quarians a home to build from. And finally, in a scenario where you bring peace between the Geth and the Quarians, Synthesis would still be the best option, because any other ending limits the Quarians to one planet. Synthesis, however, allows them to expand and grow, matching the other Milky Way races such as the Turians, humans, Solarians, Krogans, and Geth. That's it.